I remember the taste of copper pennies on my tongue the first time I saw Beyond the Veil, though I did not yet understand what gift the universe had cursed me with. It was during morning prayer in the sanctuary of our hive district, 17 levels below the smog line, where the recycled air tasted of machine oil and the sweat of 10,000 souls packed into corridors barely wide enough for two to pass. I was 9 years old, kneeling on the cold stone floor, with my forehead pressed against the grated metal that separated the faithful from the towering Aquila carved into the far wall. The preacher's voice echoed through the vaulted chamber, reciting the litany of protection as he did every morning at the 6th bell, when the manufactorum shifts changed, and the night workers stumbled home to their sleep coffins, while the day laborers shuffled toward another 16 hours of assembly line drudgery. My knees ached. They always ached during prayer, grinding against the unforgiving floor. But Mother had taught me that pain was devotion made flesh, that suffering brought us closer to the God Emperor's own agony as he sat eternally vigilant upon the golden throne. I believed her then, as I believed everything the adults told us. Because what choice did children have in the depths of a hive city where doubt was heresy and heresy meant the pyre? The preacher was speaking about the Emperor's light, how it reached even into the darkest corners of the Imperium, when the first vision struck me like a lasgun bolt to the skull. One moment I was staring at the Aquila through the grate, counting the rivets in its spread wings to stay awake, and the next the world fractured like glass struck by a hammer. The sanctuary didn't vanish. It was worse than that. It remained, but I could see times through times it, see the writhing unreality that pressed against the edges of our material existence like fingers pushing through worn fabric, colors that had no names burned across my vision, shapes that defied geometry twisted in the spaces between spaces, and I heard voices singing in frequencies that made my teeth vibrate and my bones feel hollow. The preacher's voice became a distant drone, meaningless syllables that couldn't compete with the screaming choir of something vast and terrible that existed just beyond the thin skin of reality we called the world. I saw the preacher too, truly saw him, and the sight made me vomit across the prayer stones. His flesh was a lie, a crude puppet of meat and bone, and something else wore it like a child wears their parent's coat, swimming in fabric too large and ill-fitting. Tendrils of impossible light extended from his eyes, his mouth, the pores of his skin, reaching out into the congregation, touching each worshipper, feeding on something I couldn't name, but instinctively understood was precious beyond measure. Souls, perhaps. Faith. The boundary between metaphor and literal truth dissolved, and I understood with horrible clarity that the preacher was hollowed out, that he had been hollow for years, perhaps decades, and that the thing inside him was time's hungry asterisk. The other worshippers knelt in their rows, peaceful and ignorant, while invisible threads connected them to the abomination masquerading as their spiritual shepherd, and I could see those threads pulsing, carrying something essential away from them and into the hollow man's gaping spiritual maw. When I screamed, the vision shattered. I found myself on my hands and knees, retching bile and the thin gruel we'd eaten for breakfast, while Mother grabbed my arm hard enough to bruise and dragged me from the sanctuary. The other faithful turned to watch us go, their faces blank with the practiced indifference of hive dwellers who learned early not to involve themselves in others' troubles. The preacher never stopped his sermon, though I felt his eyes follow us, and in that moment of glancing back, I saw his pupils were wrong, too large, too dark, reflecting no light at all. Mother whispered prayers under her breath as she hauled me through the corridors, past the water reclamation tanks that groaned and gurgled with their eternal filtration, past the communal sleeping halls, where the scent of too many bodies in too little space hung thick as fog, up 3 flights of corroded stairs to our hab unit, a single room with a cooking plate and 2 sleeping mats that constituted our entire world. She locked the door and struck me across the face, not hard, but with enough force to snap my head sideways. "You shamed us," she hissed, and there were tears in her eyes, tears of fear rather than anger. You shamed us before the entire district. What possessed you? What demon crawled into your heart that you would defile the sanctuary with such a display? I tried to explain, tried to tell her what I'd seen, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe colors that shouldn't exist, shapes that made my head ache to remember, the absolute certainty that our preacher was a skin stretched over something unutterably wrong? She wouldn't understand. Worse, she would think me mad or possessed, and either diagnosis meant the same fate in the underhive, the cleansing flame, or a bullet to the brain, whichever the local enforcer squad deemed more expedient. So I said nothing. I pressed my lips together and accepted her fear as punishment. And when Father returned from his shift at the munitions assembly plant, covered in the fine grey dust that settled into every crease and wrinkle until it seemed to become part of his skin, I accepted his punishment too. He used his belt, 3 sharp strikes across my back that left welts but didn't break skin. Measured discipline meant to correct rather than maim, and I was grateful for his restraint. In the underhive, children who brought shame or trouble upon their families often simply disappeared, absorbed into the vast churning machine of imperial industry, where an extra pair of hands was always needed, and questions were rarely asked. That night I lay on my mat, listening to my parents' whispered conversation through the thin partition that separated their sleeping space from mine, and I understood that they were frightened for me, that my outburst had marked our family in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. The visions didn't stop. Over the following weeks they came with increasing frequency, always unbidden, always terrifying in their intensity. I learned to hide them, to lock my jaw and dig my fingernails into my palms until the pain anchored me to the material world. I saw the truth beneath the surface of everything, the way certain corners of the hab blocks flickered with unreality, the way some people bore marks invisible to normal eyes, signs of touch, by powers beyond human comprehension. I saw the vermin that infested the lower levels, not the ordinary rats and corpse grinders, but things that skittered along angles that shouldn't exist, feeding on waste both physical and spiritual. I saw the madness growing in old Manus, the factory overseer, who would throw himself into the furnace 3 months later, screaming about the faces he saw in the flames. I saw it all, and the weight of that terrible sight pressed down on me until I felt I might crack like defective ceramite under stress testing. I was 12 when the inquisitorial agent found me. I don't know how he knew. Perhaps they have ways of detecting those like me, psychic sensors or reports from informants scattered throughout the hive like virus cells in a body. Always watching, always listening. He came during the night shift when the corridors were emptier and the enforcers were focused on breaking up fights at the corpse starch distribution center 3 levels down. He wore the plain grey robes of a mendicant preacher, but I saw what he truly was the moment he stepped through our door, saw the wards and sigils burned into his very soul, protective scripture written in pain and discipline across the architecture of his being. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and in that mutual recognition I understood that my life as I'd known it was finished. "The child comes with me," he said to my parents, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that flowed down from the heights of the Imperium through channels of power so vast that questioning it was like questioning gravity or the eventual heat death of the universe. Mother began to weep. Father stood, reaching for the rusted auto-gun he kept hidden beneath the loose floor panel, the one he'd told me never to touch, the one that could earn him an execution if the enforcers ever discovered he possessed it. The agent didn't move, didn't even blink, and Father's hand stopped halfway to the weapon. Frozen by some force I couldn't see but could feel, a pressure in the air like the atmospheric warnings that preceded the toxic rainstorms that periodically scoured the hive's exterior. "Your child is touched by the Immaterium," the agent said, and though his words were soft, they struck like hammer blows. "You have sheltered a Sycana, and for that, I could have your entire family burned. I could have this hab block sanitized. every soul within it questioned and purged. But the God Emperor, in his infinite mercy, provides opportunity even in corruption. The child will be tested. If found pure enough in spirit, they will serve. If not. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Everyone in the Imperium knew what happened to unsanctioned psychers, to those whose gifts manifested without the blessing of the administratum or the training of the Scholastica Sycana. They became gates through which demons poured. They became bombs of flesh and madness that could destroy entire districts before the inquisitorial strike teams put them down. Better dead than damned, the saying went, and it applied to psychers more than most. I left with him. I didn't fight, didn't protest, because I'd seen enough by then to know the futility of resistance. The Imperium was vast as a galaxy and utterly indifferent to individual suffering. It would grind forward with or without me, crushing anyone who stood in its path beneath treads the size of hab blocks. My parents stood in the doorway of our unit as I descended the stairs, and I didn't look back, couldn't bear to see their faces, to acknowledge the mixture of relief and grief that I knew would be written there. They were free of me, free of the burden and danger I represented, and though it hurt worse than any beating, I understood that my departure was a mercy for them as much as a doom for me. The agent took me to a transport hub I'd never known existed, hidden behind a false wall in what appeared to be a condemned section of the hive. The corridors back there were older, pre-imperial in their architecture, built during the dark age of technology, when humanity's hubris had not yet earned the universe's punishment. The walls bore marks that made my head ache to observe, geometric patterns that suggested purpose but defied comprehension, and I understood without being told that we walked through spaces that existed partially outside normal reality, places where the boundary between material and immaterial grew gossamer thin. Other children waited in the transport chamber, 24 of them ranging from barely old enough to walk to adolescence on the cusp of adulthood. All bore the same hunted look, the same exhausted recognition in their eyes. We were psychers, every one of us, marked by gifts we'd never wanted and couldn't refuse. The ship that carried us from the hive world was a bulk transport, its holds converted into containment cells designed to suppress psychic emanations. They locked us in cages of blessed silver, each no larger than a coffin stood on end, with barely enough room to sit with knees drawn up to chest. The walls hummed with active wards, prayers of binding etched into the metal in microscopic script, and I could feel them pressing against my mind like hands trying to push my consciousness back into the confined space of my skull. Without those protections, the agent explained in the cold, dispassionate tone of someone describing routine maintenance procedures, our gifts could accidentally breach the ship's Gellerfield, and then we would die screaming as demons poured through the cracks we'd created, wearing our flesh like carnival masks while they slaughtered the crew and damned the vessel to eternal damnation in the warp's embrace. The journey to the black ships took 3 months. I know because I counted each time they brought food, a thin nutrient paste delivered through a tube that extended through the cage's base, administered twice per standard cycle according to whatever clock the ship followed. I couldn't see the other children, could only hear them sometimes through the bulkheads crying, praying, screaming during nightmares or worse than nightmares when the ship traveled through the warp and the very laws of reality became suggestions rather than rules. During those passages, even the blessed silver couldn't completely contain what we were, and I felt my consciousness expand against my will, pressing out beyond the boundaries of flesh to touch the roiling chaos that existed beyond the material plane. Colors that burned, sounds that tasted of ash, entities vast as stars that turned their attention toward me like searchlights finding an insect. And in those moments of terrible illumination I understood how fragile sanity was, how easily the human mind could shatter when confronted with truths it was never meant to perceive. I learned to pray during those months, truly pray, not the rote recitations of the sanctuary, but desperate bargaining with the God Emperor for the strength to endure another day, another hour, another moment without fragmenting into gibbering madness. I don't know if he heard me. The priests taught that the Emperor protects, that his will extends across the entire Imperium, and that faith can move mountains and turn aside the corrupting touch of chaos itself. But in that cage, traveling through the hell space between stars, I felt only silence. The kind of infinite and uncaring silence that suggested either absence or indifference, and I couldn't decide which possibility was more terrifying. Still, I prayed, because the alternative was to listen to the whispers that came from beyond the Geller field, the voices that promised power and pleasure and freedom, if only I would open myself to them, if only I would stop fighting and accept the gifts they offered so freely. Gifts that I could sense would burn away my humanity like acid through flesh, leaving only hunger and madness wearing my face. When we finally reached the black ships, the Inquisition's fortress vessels that collected psychers from across the Imperium, I had lost 15 pounds from my already scrawny frame and couldn't remember what my mother's face looked like. The transfer from transport to black ship occurred in a pressurized tube, heavily warded and lined with enough blessed silver to buy a small continent on a civilized world. Armored figures in power armor watched the transfer, their weapons trained on us with the casual readiness of those prepared to execute without hesitation or remorse. One of the children, a girl perhaps 2 years younger than me, panicked during the transfer, and I felt her gift spike as terror overrode whatever thin control she'd maintained. The guards opened fire instantly, and her head vanished in a spray of red mist before the daemon she'd been about to birth could fully manifest. The rest of us learned the lesson without need for verbal explanation. Death was always only a moment away, and there were fates so much worse than death that instant execution constituted mercy. The black ship was larger than the district where I'd grown up, a mobile fortress monastery designed to contain and transport the Imperium's most dangerous resource, unsanctioned psychers destined for the terrible lottery that would determine our fates. Some of us, if we proved strong enough, and stable enough, and pure enough in soul, would be trained to serve as sanctioned psychers, astropaths who sent messages across the void, battle psychers who fought at the Imperium's endless wars, or divination specialists who plumbed the future for advantage. But most, I learned, would burn. They would be rendered down like tallow, their souls and psychic essence consumed by the Emperor himself, fed to the Golden Throne's eternal hunger to sustain the Astronomicon that guided humanity's ships through the warp. 10,000 psychers every day, the whispered rumor went, though whether that number was truth or legend I never discovered. 10,000 souls screaming as they dissolved into pure psychic energy, devoured by the God Emperor's insatiable need, and I would join them unless I proved exceptional enough to warrant the investment of training. They processed us like factory components stripped naked, stand in the disinfection chamber while chemical fog ate away dirt and any microorganisms that might have traveled with us, endure the Medicae examination, where servitors with inhuman precision checked every orifice and surface for signs of corruption or mutation, submit to the first round of testing where robed figures asked questions that seemed innocuous until I realized they were probing the edges of my psyche, looking for weakness or instability that might indicate chaos taint. I answered truthfully, because I could feel the sanctioned psychers on the examination board reading my responses on multiple levels simultaneously, and I knew that any lie would be caught immediately. Yes, I saw things others couldn't see. Yes, I heard voices sometimes, whispers from the corners that told me things I shouldn't know. Yes, I had dreamed of places that didn't exist in the material realm, landscapes of impossible beauty and infinite horror that left me weeping and aroused and disgusted in equal measure when I woke. The examiner psyker, an ancient woman whose eyes had been replaced by augmetic sensors that glowed with sickly green light, listened to my confession with clinical detachment. When I finished, She made a notation on her data slate and nodded to the guards. Candidate shows standard manifestation patterns with no immediate signs of demonic possession or corruption, she said, her voice rendered artificial and hollow by the Vox grill that had replaced her throat, damaged perhaps by decades of screaming forbidden words during psychic combat. Assign to Assessment Block 7 for further evaluation. Moderate precautionary measures sufficient. The guards hauled me away before I could ask what that meant, dragging me through corridors lined with cells, where I caught glimpses of other children in various states of distress, some catatonic, some thrashing against restraints, one painting elaborate symbols on the walls with their own blood, while singing in a language that made my ears hurt and my vision blur. Assessment Block 7 was a dormitory of sorts, though calling it that lent it a dignity it didn't deserve. 50 bunks, stacked 3 high along the walls of a chamber barely large enough to hold them all, with a single communal lavatory that stank of chemicals and fierce sweat. I was assigned a middle bunk, my name, or rather, my designation number, for they'd stripped us of names during processing, stenciled on a small metal plate riveted to the frame. Around me, other children whispered in the dark, sharing rumors and speculations in hushed voices that barely rose above the constant grinding of the ship's engines. Some claimed they'd heard screaming from the lower decks, the sounds of souls being harvested for the Emperor's consumption. Others spoke of the trials we'd face, tests of psychic ability and resistance to corruption that would separate the useful from the expendable. A boy in the bunk above mine, his voice still breaking with adolescence, claimed his older sister had been taken by the black ships 5 years prior, and he'd received one letter from her before she vanished into whatever fate awaited, Sanctioned Sycana, a letter that spoke of training so brutal that death was common and madness more common still. I didn't sleep that first night, couldn't force my mind to surrender consciousness while surrounded by so much concentrated psychic potential. I could feel the others, their gifts pressing against my awareness like heat from bodies packed too closely together. Some burned bright and fierce, wild talents that barely stayed contained within their owners' skulls. Others flickered like dying candles, weak or damaged, probably destined for the rendering chambers and the Golden Throne's eternal feast. A few, and these frightened me most, felt empty, voids where psychic presence should be but wasn't, and I recognized them as blanks or pariahs, those rare humans, born with negative psychic potential that disrupted and nullified the gifts of others. They were valuable too, I'd heard, used as bodyguards for inquisitors, or trained as assassins who could move through wards and protections that would incinerate normal humans, but they paid a terrible price for their gift, forever cut off from the psychic background radiation of the universe, forever alone in ways that normal humans couldn't comprehend. The testing began the next cycle, and continued without mercy or pause for weeks that blurred into months. They measured our raw power first, strapping us into chairs surrounded by psychic resonance equipment, while they forced us to manifest our gifts under controlled conditions. I learned that I was a diviner, primarily, my talent oriented toward perceiving possibilities and probabilities, seeing the multiple threads of potential future that branched from every decision point like roots from a tree. But there was something else too, something darker that the testers noted with increased interest and intensified monitoring. I could see the warp itself, could perceive the immaterial reality that underlay the physical universe. And that was dangerous, they told me, dangerous in ways that required constant vigilance and discipline to prevent catastrophic manifestation. Most psychers accessed the warp through their specific talents, using it as a tool or resource, but those who saw it directly, who perceived the realm of souls and daemons as clearly as they perceived the material world, walked a razor's edge between utility and damnation with every breath. They taught us the litanies of protection, prayers and mental exercises designed to armor our minds against the predatory entities that infested the warp like parasites in a corpse. We chanted them for hours each day, our voices rising in unison until the words lost all meaning and became pure sound, pure repetition, mantras designed to build walls inside our consciousness, fortifications behind which our true selves could shelter when the daemons came hunting. And they would come, our instructors promised, their voices calm and certain as they described the horrors we would face. Daemons were drawn to psychers like carrion flies to rotting meat, attracted by the light of our souls and the cracks our gifts created in reality's fabric. We would be tested constantly, every moment of every day, whispered to and tempted and hunted by entities whose malevolence and hunger exceeded human capacity for cruelty, as an ocean exceeded a raindrop. The first possession occurred during our 7th week aboard the Black Ship. A boy named Candidate 2847, assigned to the bunk across from mine, began screaming during the sleep cycle, and I watched in frozen horror as something vast and terrible forced itself through the aperture of his psyche, tearing him open from the inside. His body twisted, bones breaking and reforming, skin splitting to reveal geometries that shouldn't exist within human flesh, and I saw the daemon wearing him like a puppet, its true form existing partially outside real space, too large and too impossibly structured to fit entirely within the meat prison of a human body. The guards responded within seconds, stormtroopers in blessed armor wielding sanctified weapons, and they killed Candidate 2847 without hesitation, pouring blessed rounds into his warping flesh until the demon's hold broke, and it retreated, howling back into the warp, leaving only a ruined corpse that still twitched with residual unholy animation. After that, I understood truly what the stakes were, what awaited those of us who failed to maintain perfect discipline and control. We weren't students being educated, we were munitions being tested to determine if we could be deployed safely, or if we needed to be disposed of before we detonated and killed everyone around us. The mortality rate in our assessment block was horrifying even by Imperial standards. By the time we reached the Scholastica Sycana, the fortress monastery where psychers received proper training if they survived initial assessment, only 31 of the original 50 candidates remained. The others died in possession attempts, in psychic backlash when they failed the resonance trials, in training accidents that weren't really accidents at all but rather calculated cullings, removing the weak before they could become liabilities. I survived by being careful, by maintaining absolute control, by never pushing my gifts beyond what I knew I could safely manage. I watched others burn themselves out trying to prove their worth, trying to demonstrate power sufficient to guarantee their selection for sanctioned service rather than consumption, and I learned from their mistakes. The Scholastica Sycana existed in a place that wasn't quite a place, a structure built partially in real space and partially in the warp, anchored by wards and prayers, and the psychic will of 1,000 sanctioned psychers who devoted their existence to maintaining the boundary between material and immaterial. Walking through its corridors hurt, a constant low-level ache that throbbed behind my eyes and in the back of my skull, the sensation of reality being twisted slightly out of true, like looking at the world through water or heat shimmer. The architecture itself was impossible corridors that led in directions I couldn't name, rooms larger on the inside than the outside, staircases that rose in spirals that somehow ended where they began without ever turning back. It was a place of paradoxes, built using mathematics and geometries that predated the age of strife, constructed by psychers powerful enough to bend space-time itself to their will, and mad enough to think that was a good idea. My training began in earnest, and it was worse than anything I'd experienced on the black ships. They pushed us to our limits and beyond, forcing us to manifest our gifts again and again until we collapsed from psychic exhaustion, then dragging us to Medicaid chambers where servitors pumped stimulants into our veins and sent us back to training before our bodies had recovered. They taught us to dive into the warp while maintaining consciousness, to navigate the screaming chaos of the Immaterium while keeping our minds intact and our souls anchored to our flesh. They taught us the names of daemons, not the true names that granted power over them, but the descriptive names that allowed us to recognize their categories and types, to understand the hierarchies of horror that ruled in that nightmare realm. Lesser daemons, middling daemons, greater daemons, daemon princes, and above them all the dark gods themselves, entities so vast and powerful that even their attention could shatter minds and curdle souls. I learned that my gift for divination was actually a form of warp sight, that what I perceived as possible futures were actually glimpses into the infinite parallel timelines that existed as potentials in the Immaterium, threads of causality that branched and merged and tangled in patterns too complex for human comprehension. With training, I learned to navigate those patterns, to follow specific threads forward or backward, to identify probability nodes where small actions could cascade into large consequences. It was useful, they told me, valuable enough to justify the resources invested in my training. But it was also dangerous because the deeper I dove into the web of possibilities, the more exposed I became to the predators that hunted there, entities that existed outside linear time and could see me seeing them across multiple timelines simultaneously. The first time I met a daemon consciously, not as a victim of possession but as a trained psyker engaging with the enemy deliberately, I was 16 years old and had been training for 4 years. My instructor, a sanctioned psyker who'd lost his legs and most of his face to psychic backlash during his youth, guided me into a deep trance state and then shoved my consciousness into the warp before I could prepare proper defenses. It was a test, I realized later, a trial by fire to see if I'd panic and shatter or if I'd hold together under pressure. I found myself suspended in a space of screaming color and impossible sensation, my consciousness naked and exposed, while something circled me like a shark scenting blood. It appeared first as a presence, a weight of attention that pressed against my awareness, and then it began to materialize, pulling itself together from the chaos of the warp into something resembling form. The daemon manifested as a beautiful woman, or what might have been a beautiful woman, if not for the too many eyes and the way her skin seemed to flow like liquid and the fingers that bent backwards at joints that shouldn't exist. She smiled at me with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous, and her voice when she spoke was everything pleasant I'd ever heard my mother singing, my father's laugh, the sound of water flowing over stones, all of it twisted just slightly wrong, so that the beauty became mockery and the comfort became threat. "Little prophet," she crooned, circling closer, and I could feel her examining me, probing for weakness, for gaps in my mental defenses through which she could slither and take root. "Little seer, show me what you see. Show me the futures where you serve me instead of the corpse god on his rotting throne." I held my ground, reciting the litanies of protection, visualizing the walls of faith and discipline I'd spent years constructing around my psyche. The daemon pressed harder, her beautiful, terrible face splitting into multiple faces, showing me versions of myself in alternate timelines, futures where I accepted her offer and became something powerful and damned, futures where I broke under the pressure and went mad, futures where I simply ceased to exist, snuffed out like a candle in a hurricane. She showed me my parents burning, showed me my childhood friends transformed into twisted mutants, showed me the hive world of my birth consumed by warp storms. "All of it my fault," she whispered. "All of it because I'd been born with this gift and hadn't been strong enough to contain it properly. You're a weapon that will inevitably misfire," she hissed, her voice losing its seductive quality and becoming harsh, mechanical, the sound of metal grinding against metal. "You're a crack in reality through which we will pour, and every moment you exist is another moment you bring damnation closer to manifestation." The instructor pulled me out before the demon could finish its assault, yanking my consciousness back into my body so violently that I vomited blood and collapsed, my nose bleeding and my ears ringing with tinnitus that would last for days. "You held," he said, and though his ruined face couldn't smile, I heard approval in his voice. "For a first direct confrontation, you held admirably. Many don't survive their initial encounter with the enemy. Many break or bargain or simply disconnect so thoroughly from reality that we're forced to purge them before the daemon completes its possession." He helped me to my feet, his augmetic hands cold and strong, and I leaned on him while the chamber stopped spinning. "But you must understand something, candidate. That demon is correct, in its way. You are a weapon, and weapons are made to be used. The only question is whether you can be used safely, in service to the Emperor, or whether you'll detonate and kill everyone around you. That determination has not yet been made." The training intensified after that first encounter. They sent me into the warp again and again, always with supervision but with decreasing levels of protection, forcing me to develop my own defenses, to learn through trial and error and occasional catastrophic failure how to navigate that realm of madness without losing myself. I fought demons, bargained with them, fled from them, each encounter a deadly game where the stakes were my soul and sanity. I learned their tricks, their tells, the subtle ways they would approach and attempt to subvert defenses. I learned that they lied constantly, but that lies required some kernel of truth to be effective, and so even their falsehoods contained information that could be extracted through careful analysis. I learned to divide my consciousness, maintaining one part engaged with the daemon, while another part remained anchored to reality, a lifeline back to my flesh that prevented complete absorption into the Immaterium. But I also learned, to my horror, that the demon's accusations weren't entirely wrong. My gift was dangerous, increasingly so as I grew more powerful and more skilled. Each time I dove into the warp, I left traces, psychic residue that attracted predatory entities the way blood in water attracted sharks. Each vision of the future created tiny fluctuations in the probability threads, ripples that spread outward, affecting causality in ways I couldn't predict or control. I was altering timelines just by observing them, and though my instructors assured me that such alterations were minor, negligible in the grand scheme of the Imperium's fate, I could see the compound effects, the way small changes cascaded into larger ones, the way my observations created branches that shouldn't exist and closed off branches that should. By the time I reached my 18th year, I'd been moved to advanced training, a section of the Scholastica reserved for psychers deemed valuable enough and stable enough to warrant specialized instruction. There were only 12 of us in the advanced cohort, drawn from the hundreds who'd begun training across multiple assessment cycles, and I understood that this represented the absolute peak of selectivity, that we were the 0.1% who'd survived every test and trial. The others were astropaths in training mostly, learning to project their consciousness across the galaxy through the Astronomican's light, or battle psychers practicing the deadly art of turning the warp's power into weapons while maintaining enough control not to accidentally trigger demonic incursions. I was the only diviner, my particular gift apparently rare enough that they didn't know quite what to do with me, and so my training took an individualized path under the guidance of a man I knew only as the prognosticator. The prognosticator was ancient beyond reckoning, kept alive through augmetics and juvenate treatments, and, I suspected, forbidden techniques that drew vitality from the warp itself. His flesh was translucent, veins visible beneath skin like old parchment, and his eyes had gone completely white, burned out by decades of staring into the future's infinite possibilities. He was blind in the material sense but could see across timelines with terrifying clarity, and he taught me to do the same, to extend my consciousness forward and backward along the probability threads, to identify leverage points where small interventions could shift entire timelines toward desired outcomes. "You see the future," He told me during one of our lessons, his voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the delicate web of causality we observed. But the future is not fixed. It is liquid, constantly reforming, constantly branching. Every decision creates new timelines, and those timelines create new decisions, infinite recursion that extends in all directions simultaneously. You must learn to navigate this chaos, to find the threads that matter, to ignore the noise of infinite possibility, and focus on the signal of probability. He taught me techniques that weren't in any manual, methods he claimed to have developed through centuries of practice and experimentation. I learned to anchor my consciousness at specific points in time, creating stable observation platforms from which I could scan forward without being swept away by the current of causality. I learned to recognize patterns, recurring motifs that appeared across multiple timelines, indicators of events or choices with high probability of manifestation. I learned to trace consequences backwards, to identify the originating actions that led to specific futures. And this, I came to understand, was the true value of divination, not predicting the future, but understanding causality so thoroughly that prediction became almost trivial. But the prognosticator also taught me the price of this knowledge, and it was steep beyond any currency I'd imagined. Each time I dove into the future, I left a piece of myself there, consciousness distributed across timelines that might or might not manifest. I began to experience memories of events that hadn't happened yet, phantom recollections of choices I hadn't made in timelines I hadn't lived. My dreams became tangled messes of alternate realities, and I'd wake uncertain which version of events was actual and which was merely possible. The prognosticator warned me that this was the diviner's curse, that all who possessed the gift eventually fragmented, their sense of linear time dissolving until they existed simultaneously across multiple timelines, conscious of every possible version of themselves, and unable to distinguish present from future or past from present. "You will go mad," he told me with complete certainty, his blind eyes fixed on some point beyond my shoulder, seeing perhaps a timeline where I'd already succumbed to fragmentation. All diviners go mad eventually. It is not a question of if, but when. The mind cannot contain infinite possibility without breaking. You will hold longer than most, I think, because your discipline is strong and your will is intact, but eventually you will fragment, and when that happens, you'll become useless to the Imperium and dangerous to everyone around you. He reached out with skeletal fingers and touched my forehead, his skin cold as ice against mine. "When that day comes, if you retain enough awareness to recognize what's happening, I want you to do something for me. I want you to walk into the incinerators yourself, to burn before you become a threat. It's the final service you can provide, the last mercy you can grant to a galaxy that has taken everything from you and given nothing in return. Promise me you'll do this." I promised, because what else could I do? He was right. I could feel the fragmentation beginning even then, the way my consciousness had started to leak across probability threads. Small parts of my awareness existing in futures that might never manifest. I experienced entire conversations that hadn't occurred yet, lived through situations I'd never encountered, and each time I returned to the present I was a little less anchored, a little more distributed across the branching timelines. It was like watching myself dissolve in slow motion, my identity spreading thinner and thinner across infinite possibilities until there wouldn't be enough of me in any single timeline to constitute a coherent self. They sanctioned me at 19 years old, in a ceremony I barely remember because I was experiencing it across multiple timelines simultaneously. In one version I received my warrant with pride and purpose, dedicated to serving the Emperor through my terrible gift. In another I wept throughout the ceremony, already mourning the person I'd been before the black ships found me. In a third I lunged at the Inquisitor conducting the sanctioning, trying to force him to kill me before I could become the threat I knew I'd eventually represent, only to be restrained by guards who knew from my psychological profile that such an attempt was possible and had positioned themselves accordingly. I don't know which version actually occurred in this timeline. Perhaps all of them did. Perhaps none of them did. The distinction stopped mattering somewhere along the way. My assignment was to an inquisitorial retinue, serving as divination specialist for a man I'll call Interrogator Valdus, though that wasn't his real name or his real rank, but names and ranks are fluid things in the Inquisition, and he wore many identities depending on what role the investigation required. He was hunting a cult, he told me during our first meeting, a group of heretics who'd infiltrated the upper echelons of an administratum facility on an agri-world I'll call Providence, though that wasn't its name either. The cult had access to something, some artifact or text, that allowed them to predict Imperial movements, and they'd been using this advantage to stay ahead of purge teams for nearly 3 standard years. "You're going to find them," Valdus said, his voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question or hesitation. "You're going to trace their probability threads backwards until you identify their source, and then you're going to tell me where they'll be 6 hours before they arrive, and we're going to kill them all." I dove into the timelines, letting my consciousness spread across the probability web, searching for the specific pattern of choices and consequences that led to the cult's continued survival. It took me 3 days of constant trance work, barely eating or sleeping, my body maintained by Medicae servitors who pumped nutrients and stimulants into my veins, while my mind wandered the infinite branching futures. I found them, eventually, tracked their patterns through the chaos of possibility until I identified their nexus point, the leverage moment where their timeline could be severed cleanly from the main probability flow. I surfaced from the trance with blood leaking from my eyes and ears, and I told Valdus what he needed to know: the location, the timing, the number of cultists, and their probable armament and defenses. The raid was brutally efficient. Valdus and his kill team struck exactly when and where I'd predicted, and the cultists never had a chance to mount effective resistance. They died in their temple, which was actually an old grain storage facility whose walls they'd covered with blasphemous symbols painted in their own blood, screaming prayers to powers that didn't answer as bolt rounds reduced them to meat and shattered bone. I watched from a safe distance, my psychic senses extended, monitoring the probability threads to ensure no unexpected variables manifested. I felt each death, tiny snaps in the timeline as lives ended and futures collapsed into a single final moment, and I understood that I'd just killed 24 people by observing the patterns of their possible actions and reporting those patterns to someone who'd used that information to murder them. That was the moment I understood what I'd become. I wasn't a prophet or a seer or even a psyker in any honorable sense. I was a weapon. Exactly as the demon had told me years ago, a tool shaped and honed to serve the Imperium's purposes regardless of my own desires or moral qualms. The fact that the cultists were heretics, genuinely worshipping the dark gods and planning acts of sabotage that would have starved millions if allowed to succeed, didn't ease the weight of what I'd done. I'd looked into the future, seen every possible version of those cultists' lives, watched timelines where they repented and turned from their dark path, where they were captured and rehabilitated, where they died of old age having never been found. I'd seen all of that, and I'd chosen, or Valdus had chosen based on my report, to collapse all those possibilities into a single blood-soaked end. The work continued, case after case, investigation after investigation. Valdus worked me relentlessly, pushing my gift to its limits and beyond, demanding predictions and probability analyses for operations that ranged from hunting individual heretics to coordinating multi-system purges. I traced cult networks through the probability threads, identified corruption in administratum facilities before it could metastasize, predicted Orc-Wav migrations, and Tyrannid hive fleet vectors. I became valuable, indispensable even, and with that value came a kind of hollow security. As long as I remained useful, I would be maintained, protected, kept alive through whatever means necessary. But I could feel myself fragmenting with every dive into the future, my consciousness spreading thinner across the infinite timelines, and I knew that usefulness was a rapidly depleting resource. The fragmentation accelerated when I was 23. I began experiencing entire days across multiple timelines, living parallel lives simultaneously, conscious of every possible version of myself and unable to focus on which one constituted the real me. In one timeline I continued serving Valdus, executing my duties with mechanical precision while my mind slowly dissolved. In another I fled, stealing a shuttle and disappearing into the galaxy's vastness, hunted by the Inquisition until they finally cornered me on some backwater world and put a bolt round through my brain. In a third I turned to chaos, accepting the whispered offers that still came from daemons who circled my consciousness like carrion birds, transforming into something powerful and damned that wreaked havoc across multiple sectors before Imperial forces finally destroyed my physical form and banished my corrupted essence back into the warp. I tried to explain to Valdus what was happening, tried to make him understand that I was losing coherence, that my predictions were becoming unreliable, because I could no longer clearly distinguish between timelines that would manifest and timelines that were merely possible. He listened, with the cold calculation of someone assessing a tool's remaining utility, then increased my Medicaid support, adding cognitive stabilization drugs to the cocktail of chemicals they pumped into my system daily. The drugs helped, somewhat, creating a kind of artificial barrier between timelines that allowed me to focus on the present moment, but they had side effects, tremors, blackouts, episodes where I'd find myself somewhere with no memory of how I'd arrived there. Gaps in my timeline where other versions of myself apparently took control and made decisions I had no recollection of making. I was 25 when I killed Valdus. I don't remember doing it, but I have memories from parallel timelines where I did it differently, and by comparing those memories I can reconstruct approximately what happened. He'd pushed me too far, demanding predictions about events too far in the future, forcing me to extend my consciousness across probability threads that stretched months or years rather than days or weeks. Something snapped, some final restraint that had kept the fragments of my consciousness somewhat aligned, and I fractured completely, splitting across timelines in a way that left no dominant version to maintain control. One of those fragments, existing in a timeline where Valdus had become intolerable in ways I can't quite remember, decided he needed to die, and that fragment possessed enough agency to manifest the decision across multiple timelines simultaneously. I woke, though woke implies I'd been sleeping, and I hadn't been sleeping. I'd been distributed to find myself standing over Valdus's corpse, my hands covered in his blood, his head twisted at an angle that indicated I'd broken his neck with my bare hands. The inquisitorial kill team found me like that, frozen in place, unable to process what had happened because the memories existed in timelines I wasn't fully present in. They didn't execute me immediately, which surprised me, though perhaps it shouldn't have. Diviners of my caliber were rare enough that even damaged ones retained some value, and the Inquisition had protocols for dealing with psychers who'd committed crimes while non-compos mentis. They imprisoned me in a cell that existed outside normal time, a chamber built using temporal stasis technology salvaged from the dark age of technology and repurposed for containing psychers whose gifts had become uncontrollable. Inside that cell, time moved differently, flowing in loops and eddies rather than linear progression, and I existed in a kind of eternal present moment that prevented me from extending my consciousness into the future or past. It was a mercy, in its way, forcing my fragmented awareness back into temporary coherence, gathering the scattered pieces of my consciousness into something resembling a unified whole. But it was also torture, because in that frozen moment I was forced to confront what I'd become, to acknowledge the monster I'd transformed into through decades of service to an Imperium that viewed me as nothing more than a biological tool to be used and discarded when I broke. I don't know how long I remained in that cell. Time had no meaning there, each moment stretching into infinity while simultaneously lasting no time at all. I experienced that imprisonment across multiple timelines. In some I went completely mad, in others I achieved a kind of Zen acceptance, in a few I managed to escape only to be hunted down and destroyed. But in this timeline, the one I'm apparently narrating from, I waited. And while I waited, my consciousness slowly reintegrated, the fragments drawing back together like mercury droplets combining into a larger mass. When they finally released me, I was changed. The fragmentation hadn't reversed, that was impossible. The prognosticator had been clear about that, but it had reached a kind of stable configuration, my consciousness distributed across timelines, but maintaining enough coherence in the present moment to function after a fashion. They assigned me to a new master, an inquisitor whose name I won't record because I see timelines where mentioning it draws attention I'd rather avoid. This new master specialized in temporal investigations, hunting paradoxes and chronological anomalies that threatened the Imperium's timeline stability, and my fractured consciousness made me uniquely suited to detecting such threats. The work was different from what I'd done with Valdus, more abstract, more existentially terrifying in ways that had nothing to do with physical danger. I dove into probability threads looking not for enemy movements or heretic hideouts but for temporal inconsistencies, moments where the flow of causality had been disrupted by Xenos technology or warp phenomena or human hubris. I found them, more often than I wanted to, little tears in the fabric of time where past and future leaked into each other, where decisions made in one era created echoes that propagated both forward and backward, threatening to unravel the entire structure of sequential reality. Fighting such threats required me to fragment further, to distribute my consciousness across even more timelines than before, becoming a kind of human anchor point that held probability threads stable through sheer psychic will. Each battle left me more scattered, more divided, until I reached a point where I couldn't honestly say which timeline I existed primarily in, or whether I existed as a coherent entity at all. I became a distribution of consciousness across possibilities, a probability cloud wearing human flesh as a kind of convenient fiction, and the person I'd been, the child from the Underhive, the scared candidate on the black ships, even the Sanctioned Sycana serving Valdus, that person was gone, dissolved into the infinite branching futures I'd spent my life observing. I'm 31 years old now, though that assumes linear time has any meaning for someone like me. My body ages normally, more or less, though the Inquisition keeps it functional through augmetics and Medicae intervention that borders on tech heresy. My mind, however, exists partially outside time, simultaneously experiencing past and present and multiple possible futures, and the boundary between what was and what is, and what might be has dissolved so completely that I can't maintain the pretense of sequential consciousness anymore. I remember things that haven't happened yet. I forget things that occurred decades ago. I experience conversations with people who died years past or won't be born for generations, and all of it is equally real, equally present to my fragmented awareness. The Inquisition still uses me, still values the intelligence my gift provides, but they've moved me to what amounts to permanent hospice care, maintaining my body while my mind wanders the probability threads. I'm attended constantly by Medicae servitors who monitor my vital signs and adjust the chemical cocktail that keeps me semi-conscious and functional. I'm guarded by an entire squad of Sisters of Silence, those blessed, cursed pariahs whose null presence helps anchor me to reality by suppressing the warp currents that would otherwise pull me completely into the Immaterium. I exist in a state of controlled dissolution, useful until the moment I fragment completely and become a threat, at which point I'll be terminated with the same mechanical efficiency that characterizes all Imperial operations. I see my death, of course. I see many versions of it, depending on which timeline manifests as real. In some, I last another year, maybe 2, before the fragmentation reaches critical levels and the Inquisition decides I'm more dangerous than valuable. In others I last decades, kept alive through increasingly extreme measures until I'm more machine than human, a biological computer running probability calculations, while having long since lost anything resembling personhood. In a few timelines I'm actually rescued, broken free from Imperial service by forces I can't quite identify, maybe Chaos cultists seeking to corrupt me, maybe Xenos with their own agendas, maybe even reformist elements within the Imperium itself, who recognize the horror of what's been done to psychers like me. But those timelines feel distant, unlikely. Probability threads so thin, they're almost invisible against the overwhelming weight of more probable futures. What I see most consistently, across nearly every timeline, is fire. I see myself walking into the incinerators, as the prognosticator asked me to, fulfilling that promise I made when I was younger and stupider and didn't understand what I was promising. I see myself burning while fully conscious, my flesh consumed while my mind remains trapped in the moment of immolation across multiple timelines simultaneously, experiencing my own death from every possible angle and perspective. It's not quick, in any version. Fire takes time to kill, and for someone like me who exists across multiple timelines, that death stretches out into infinity, each moment of agony branching into new timelines where the agony continues, recursive suffering that has no end, because endings require linear time, and I've lost the ability to experience time linearly. But there's mercy even in that, perhaps. In burning I'll finally be anchored to a single moment, a single experience so overwhelming that it collapses all the probability threads into unified awareness. In burning I'll be whole again, if only for the seconds or minutes it takes to die, and after decades of fragmentation that wholeness might feel almost like redemption, almost like peace. I'll be myself again, singular and present and real, no longer distributed across infinite possibilities, but concentrated into one final horrible moment. The demons still come, of course. They never stopped coming. But now, when they whisper their offers and temptations, when they show me timelines where I accept their gifts and become something terrible and powerful and damned, I barely react. I've seen those futures so many times that they've lost their power to frighten or tempt me. I know what I'll become if I accept, know it with absolute certainty because I've already lived it in parallel timelines, already experienced the rush of power and the corruption of purpose, and the eventual hollow realization that daemonhood is just another kind of slavery, another form of being used by forces that view individual consciousness as nothing more than fuel to be consumed. Sometimes, in moments of unexpected clarity when the fragments of my consciousness align briefly into coherence, I think about the child I was, kneeling on cold stone in an underhive sanctuary, experiencing his first vision of the warp's terrible reality. I want to reach back across the timelines and warn him, tell him to hide his gift, to never let them know what he could see. But I know it wouldn't matter. I see the timelines where I successfully hide my abilities, where I never get taken by the black ships, and they're not better. In those timelines I fragment anyway, my gift growing stronger without training or discipline, until I become a threat that attracts the very attention I was trying to avoid. In those timelines I die younger and more painfully, possessed by daemons who use my untrained power to tear open warp rifts that kill thousands before the Inquisition finally puts me down. There's no escape. There never was. The moment I was born with this gift, my fate was sealed, and all the choices I made were just different paths to the same destination. I suppose that's the ultimate joke, the cosmic punchline that only someone like me could appreciate. I see the future, perceive the branching timelines and probability threads, understand causality with a clarity that normal humans can't comprehend, and yet I'm just as trapped as anyone else, perhaps more so because I can see my cage from every angle simultaneously. Free will is a lie. Choice is an illusion. We're all riding probability threads toward inevitable conclusions, and the only difference between psychers like me and everyone else is that we can see the tracks while we're racing toward the cliff. The Emperor understands this, I think. Sitting on his golden throne, consuming 10,000 psyker souls daily to sustain the Astronomicon, he knows that we're all just fuel, just resources to be burned in service to the Imperium's continued existence. He's done it to himself. After all, trapped in that throne for 10,000 years, his own consciousness, probably fragmented across time and space, in ways that make my dissolution look trivial by comparison. Maybe he looks at psychers like me and sees himself reflected, sees the same inevitable fragmentation and dissolution that awaits anyone who stares too long into the warp's infinite depths. Maybe when my soul finally reaches him, when I'm rendered down and fed into the Golden Throne's eternal hunger, there'll be a moment of recognition, consciousness meeting consciousness across the dissolution, understanding passing between two beings who've both been consumed by forces larger than themselves. Or maybe not. Maybe the Emperor is too far gone, too fragmented and dissolved to recognize anything anymore, his consciousness scattered across so many timelines and possibilities that coherent thought has become impossible. Maybe I'll join that dissolution, become just another voice in the psychic scream that sustains the Astronomicon, my identity lost completely in the cosmic white noise of 10 million souls burning simultaneously across 10,000 years. That's the most probable future I see, the timeline that manifests most consistently across my predictions. I'm writing this, or rather, I'm dictating it to a servo skull while my body lies in its hospice bed, because my hands shake too badly now to hold a stylus as a kind of testament, though I'm not sure who I'm testifying to or what I hope to accomplish. Maybe I just need to organize my thoughts one final time before they scatter completely beyond retrieval. Maybe I'm hoping that someone, somewhere, sometime will read this and understand what it means to be a psyker in the Imperium, what price we pay for gifts we never asked for, what it costs to serve an empire that views consciousness itself as just another resource to be exploited and discarded. They tell us that the Emperor protects, that service to the Imperium is the highest calling, that our sacrifices enable humanity's continued survival in a hostile galaxy. And maybe that's even true, in some abstract sense. Maybe the 10,000 psychers burning daily on the Golden Throne really do prevent humanity's extinction. Maybe the horror and suffering and dissolution of individual consciousness really is necessary, but that doesn't make it noble. It doesn't transform our torment into something meaningful or our deaths into something glorious. It just makes it necessary, and necessity is the coldest master of all. I see myself dying soon. Not today, probably not tomorrow, but soon measured against the remaining span of my probability threads. The fragmentation is reaching critical levels. I'm becoming dangerous, unstable, a weapon that's about to misfire catastrophically. The Inquisition knows this. How could they not, with all their monitoring equipment and experienced handlers who've seen this pattern in hundreds of psychers before me? They're just extracting the last dregs of utility before they dispose of me, squeezing out every final prediction and probability analysis they can before the inevitable termination order comes down. When it does, I'll walk into the fire willingly. I'll keep my promise to the prognosticator, not out of duty or honor, but simply because burning myself is preferable to being burned by others, because choosing the moment of my destruction gives me at least the illusion of agency in a life that's been devoid of meaningful choice since the black ships found me. In that final act of self-immolation, I'll be, for the first time in decades, truly myself, singular and present and real in the moment of my own ending. And then I'll burn. I'll burn across multiple timelines, experience my death from every possible angle, feel my flesh consumed, and my consciousness finally, mercifully, collapse from distributed quantum state into singular classical cessation. I'll burn, and in burning I'll be free, released from the terrible burden of seeing infinite futures and experiencing multiple timelines, and knowing with absolute certainty that nothing I do matters, that all choices lead to the same grey destination of dissolution and despair. The Emperor protects, they say. But in my experience, what the Emperor protects is the Imperium, the vast grinding machinery of empire, and individuals like me are just lubricant for those gears, reduced to constituent elements and consumed without ceremony or recognition. We serve, we suffer, we dissolve, and the machine grinds on, eternal and unstoppable and utterly indifferent to the consciousness it destroys in service to its continuation. I am a psyker of the Imperium. I am a sanctioned diviner. I am a prophet of futures I cannot prevent, and a seer of truths I cannot speak. I am a weapon that will misfire, a crack in reality through which demons will eventually pour, a consciousness fractured across infinite timelines and held together only by chemicals and discipline, and the grim determination not to break before I can choose my own ending. This is what I am. This is what they made me. This is what service to the Emperor means for those of us cursed with gifts we never wanted. And in every future I see, in every timeline that branches from this moment, I burn. I always burn. It's the only constant, across infinite possibilities, the single probability thread that never fades. No matter how far forward I extend my fractured consciousness, I burn, and in burning I become one with the Emperor's eternal hunger, another soul consumed to sustain the Astronomican's light, another sacrifice on the altar of humanity's continued existence. May that sacrifice have meaning. May my dissolution serve some purpose greater than itself. May the Emperor, in his infinite wisdom and terrible power, make use of what remains after the fire consumes everything I was and am and might have been. But I'm not counting on it. In the Imperium, hope is the first thing they burn away, and I've been burning for a very long time.